There we go. We've got the Facebook Live event started. We've got the recording started, and the lunch siren just went off here in town to let us know that it is 12 o'clock on Tuesday, September 14th. So we're going to get started with our TMN Tuesday event. Thank you guys for joining us today for our September program. We're excited to have Kelsey. Let me make sure that I'm sharing the right thing. We're excited to have Kelsey Lowe share a little bit about the secret life of squirrels. Before we turn the reins over to Kelsey and tell you a little bit about what she's going to be talking about today, we always like to run through a quick tech check for our program. And so today's event, as an attendee, don't worry, you cannot unmute or share your video, but that is on purpose. Many times with these events, we have a couple of thousand folks joining us, and we have a couple of hundred folks joining us today. So it's exciting to have so many folks, but we want to make sure that we give Kelsey the ability to share the incredible secret life that she's going to be sharing with us today, and giving her that capacity to do so. So we do have a way that you can interact with her, and I'll go through that in just a second. But if you are starting to see me flip screens and you're seeing my mouth move, but you're not hearing us still, you want to make sure that you've got your audio settings adjusted, turn that volume up, make sure your speakers are plugged in. Take a quick screenshot of this page, and this will help you to troubleshoot that if you're still having issues with that. And hopefully by now you've gotten all of your WebEx glitches out of the way. Again, we talked about this earlier, but with Kelsey's presentation today, we're going to be using Q&A. The Q&A function in WebEx allows us to ask questions, allows you as attendees to ask questions of Kelsey throughout her presentation. We'll kind of keep a log of all of those questions, and then when she says, are there any questions, and she opens it up for discussion, Michelle and I as moderators we'll take those questions and ask those questions of Kelsey out loud. To help us as moderators ask the questions that you intend, please use full sentences, no acronyms, try your best at spelling so that we can understand your question and make sure that we get the right question asked of Kelsey today. Also, if you will ask that question to all panelists in the Q&A box, that'll help to make sure that we all get to see those questions and funnel those to Kelsey appropriately at that time. Finally, before we kick this off and Michelle introduces our speaker and our topic for today, our final tech is if you have any more issues with WebEx, we have that help call center phone number available, as well as the FAQ pages, not only on their page, but also on our page as well. All right, and with that, Michelle, if you want to get us started.
So we'd like to welcome you for our TMN Tuesday event. This is September's event with Kelsey Lowe with the Secret Life of Squirrels. And before I introduce Kelsey, we just want to give you a couple updates on TMN Tuesdays for this month and next month coming up too. September 21st, we have our next TMN Tuesday event, which is our unique installment for this year, the Be the Change series. We will be looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion with this series. And next week's event is how to win friends and influence people for conservation. Kelly Simon, will be leading a panel discussion next week for that event. So join us, be sure to register and join us if you're interested in that Be the Change series next week. And then October this year, our next TMN Tuesday will be a project showcase of our Texas Master Naturalist chapters. Each year with our annual meeting event, we have a exemplarily project award that each of our chapters can participate in or submit a project to be to compete in the awards. And back by popular demand. Last year we held this as a virtual event, and this year we're holding it again as a virtual event to showcase all of these projects as our October TMN Tuesday and in association with our annual meeting. Speaking of our annual meeting, we would like you to join us for our annual meeting coming up October 21st to the 24th in Irving, Texas. This is a hybrid event, so you could register to attend in person or register to be a virtual participant of the meeting. And there's more information about the annual meeting, the link there on the screen, and then we'll be dropping that information in the chat too. As with all of our TMN Tuesday events, these are advanced training events that you can obtain advanced training credit for, watching either live or watching our recordings of TMN Tuesdays after the fact on our TMN website. Moving forward, just a little bit of webinar etiquette. Mary Pearl covered and explained that you're not able to unmute. And to use the Q&A box for submitting your questions for Kelsey today. We ask that you keep Q&A on topic related to what's being presented and the discussion at that time. We will strive our best to keep this session to 1 hour for you with presentation and questions following afterwards. And then lastly, again, if you're experiencing any issues with WebEx, we have mentioned the help desk number and the resources on our webpage if you continue to experience difficulties with WebEx. And as I mentioned, we're recording this session, and so the recording will be up on our website hopefully by the morning or tomorrow at the latest. And so as with all of our TMN Tuesday events, the recordings are available on our website there. So if you want to come back to this one or any others, and I know you'll want to come back to this one because it's very exciting and backed by popular demand, you can find those on our website. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome back Kelsey Lowe. Kelsey is the Adult Programs Manager at Houston Arboretum and Nature Center. And Kelsey gave a version of The Secret Life of Squirrels at our a presentation at our annual meeting last year. And it was an astounding success. So enthusiastic. We've had so many requests for a repeat. So refresh and repeat on The Secret Life of Squirrels. So today we bring you Kelsey Lowe. She's the Adult Programs Manager at the Houston Arboretum and Nature Center. She has a broad background in biology and a wide range of personal interests. Kelsey helps other adults connect to Houston's urban wilderness through classes on wildlife, native plants, art, cooking, and bird watching. And of course, she's joining us here today with The Secret Life of Squirrels for our Texas Master Naturalist TMN Tuesdays. Kelsey has been a birder for nearly 25 years and leads the Arboretum's monthly bird survey and annual Christmas bird count. She also advocates for nature and education as a member of the City of Sugar Land Parks Board, the Cullinan Park Conservancy, and our Texas Parks and Wildlife Urban Outreach Advisory Committee. So Kelsey, welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much, Mary Pearl and Michelle. That was wonderful. I feel very unworthy of all of this excitement. I hope it will be fun. Squirrels are a great topic. Hopefully you guys can hear me. It worked earlier in the tech check, but okay, good. I'm getting a nod. I always want to make sure I'm not speaking into a void. So hello to everyone. I wish I could see your happy faces, but I will just have to imagine you. As Mary Pearl and Michelle said, please throw your questions in the Q&A. I will do my best to answer them at points during this and at the end. So don't panic if I don't answer your question during the presentation. And let's, real quick, background to this talk. I didn't used to like squirrels. In fact, I hated squirrels quite passionately. I'm a bird person. I've worked on birds most of my life. I studied birds. and I studied cavity nesting birds, so birds that nest in tree holes. And squirrels were the bane of my existence for a while. So I really didn't like them very much. But working at Houston Arboretum and Nature Center now, I get a lot of squirrel lovers because people see them in their backyards and they love them and ask me questions about them. And I would get really frustrated because I wanted to talk about birds. I didn't want to talk about dumb squirrels. But by popular demand, I decided I would do a class on squirrels very grudgingly. I was not excited about it. But as I started to do my research for the class, I've kind of done a 180 on squirrels. They have wormed their furry ways into my heart. They're just so fascinating, so adaptable, and so tenacious. It's hard not to love them. So I hope you enjoy learning a little bit about the secret life of squirrels. And like me, if you're not a huge squirrel fan already, maybe you'll have something to enjoy by the end of this talk. All right, let me see if I can get my PowerPoint on screen. There we go. All right.
Looks good, Kelsey.
Fabulous. So today we will be talking about the secret life of squirrels. So when I do this talk, there's kind of two versions. One is for the general public, and one is for naturalists like yourself. So you're all Texas Master Naturalists. You're either trained or on your way to being trained, and you're a little more advanced. You guys know a lot about what's going on in Texas when it comes to wildlife and ecology. I'm sure most of you are nature lovers yourselves, but you probably want to go a little deeper. So for you guys, I say, don't just think of squirrels as squirrels. Don't be like me. Don't just ignore squirrels when you're walking around outside with people, members of the public or community members or your HOA board. Don't ignore squirrels. Squirrels are a gateway drug. That's what I didn't understand up until recently. So squirrels are a way to get people interested in animal anatomy, in adaptations, in animal behavior, ecology, and then conservation. Once you've hooked someone, they're much more likely to start paying attention to other groups of animals or plants or ecology as a whole or other interesting conservation interests. So if people are interested in squirrels, by golly, that's the way to hook them. So squirrels are a really, really good gateway drug to nature. And that's mostly because they're everywhere. I mean, squirrels are in trash cans. Squirrels are in the densest urban centers. Squirrels are in the most rural places. There's some kind of squirrel near you, I guarantee it, in Texas. And not just in Texas. I say we as in Texans, when we think of squirrels, we tend to think of a fairly limited selection of quote unquote boring backyard wildlife. It's easy to take squirrels for granted, but they are quite diverse and they are literally everywhere. This little montage is just a tiny section of the diversity of squirrels in the world. They range from African pygmy squirrels that are living in humid rainforests in Africa, and they are less than 2 inches long, to Indian giant squirrels. That very relaxed fellow, kind of up at the top center, laying on the tree branch, he's over 3 feet long. That's a big squirrel. So there's a pretty massive size range when it comes to squirrels, and there's a lot of anatomical diversity. I mean, look at the difference between the kind of freaky looking Asian flying squirrel, which is the reddish looking guy with the long skinny tail and the big eyes in the left center. Compare him to the little chunky short-tailed prairie dog on the far right, or a little stocky chipmunk in the top right, or even a big fat marmot down in the bottom right. Squirrels are in rainforests, squirrels are in grasslands, squirrels are in deserts, squirrels are all the way up at the top of the Himalayas. That marmot, that big chunky brown squirrel on the bottom right, he is a Himalayan marmot. They're living way, way up in some of the highest altitude of any creature on the planet. So there's squirrels everywhere. So they are absolutely perfect for getting people engaged with nature because they're just so available. If you're a teacher, I guarantee you, there's a squirrel somewhere nearby. You can bring your kids to look at that squirrel. You don't have to pay for a zoo ticket. You can just go look at the squirrels. So what is a squirrel? We just looked at a pretty wide diversity of shapes, sizes, and colors. So what unifies this group? So here we get to start talking about anatomy and adaptations. So what are squirrels? Squirrels are mammals. They've got fur. They produce milk. They give birth to live young. They're warm-blooded. Squirrels are also rodents. So they're part of a group of mammals that includes mice and rats. They have those long buck teeth in the front that keep growing over the course of their lives. Really good for chewing tough plant material and other things. We're going to talk about that later. That orange color, by the way, that you see in the teeth is actually iron, the metal iron. That helps reinforce the teeth to make them even stronger. You'll also notice something, if you know anything about skull anatomy, you'll notice there's something really weird going on with the skull of squirrels. So unlike every other kind of rodent, squirrels have something really weird going on with their cheeks. So humor me. I'm just going to have to pretend that you're doing this because I can't see. But if you will put your hand on your cheekbone underneath your eye, so that nice ridge of bone underneath your eye, that's called the zygomatic arch. That's a fancy word for cheekbone. And you'll see on the squirrel skull, he's got his nice round eye socket, and then he's got his zygomatic arch, that cheekbone right underneath his eye, just like us. But when you look at the skull from the front, you will notice you can't even see the squirrel's eyes because its zygomatic arch has this huge flat surface, very much unlike ours. That is called a zygomatic plate. You don't have to worry about the words. What you do need to see is that that is an enormous space on his skull for jaw muscles to attach. So squirrels have these crazy pants cheekbones, and that immense surface area for muscles to attach means that squirrels have an incredibly strong bite force, which is really helpful for them in their diet. So that's a unique trait to squirrels. Another thing that you might not have noticed, I honestly never noticed because I never really looked at squirrels properly, is that squirrels have weird feet. Squirrel front feet, their thumb, their fifth digit, is reduced greatly. So it's just a little teeny nub. So you'll see on that close-up of the squirrel paws, he's got his 4 little fingers with little sharp claws, but his thumb is super reduced. So that's another unique trait to squirrels when it comes to rodents. So these are some of the things that make a squirrel a squirrel. So all of those squirrels, no matter how they look, no matter where they are in the world, they share these anatomical traits. And that brings us to those wonderful body types. As diverse as those squirrels were in that montage, they fall into sort of 3 broad categories. And I love this about squirrels because it opens so many great conversations about adaptations and form and function. So let's go through the list. On the far left, we have a tree squirrel. A lot of people, like myself, who live in a tree-filled area, this is what I think of when I think of a squirrel. People in Europe, a lot of people in Africa and Asia as well would think of this as a classic squirrel. They have long bodies. They have short but sturdy legs with extremely flexible feet. If you'll notice on that picture, the ankles on that squirrel can turn completely backwards. So that allows the squirrel to flip his back feet completely backwards, and that lets them climb headfirst down trees. They have long, fluffy tails to help them balance as they're climbing and jumping. And they have pretty big eyes and sort of mid-sized ears, good for sensing their environment. That's a classic tree squirrel. Now, for those of you who do not live in forested environments, if you're a more grassland or desert dweller, you may think of the middle picture as a squirrel. This is a classic ground squirrel. This is a prairie dog, but there's lots of ground squirrels. They are much chunkier, very sturdy. Their legs are extremely strong. They have long, thick claws, and they use those sturdy legs and long claws for digging. So these are burrowing squirrels. These guys aren't running and jumping around in the trees. These guys are digging in the ground. They have a lot of other adaptations for being in the ground. Their tails are very short because they don't need long tails for balance. They need to keep those tails out of the way to let them dig in constricted spaces. Their ears are also very short and often folded over to help keep dirt from sticking into their ears. They have nice big eyes for vision, but color vision isn't quite as important for them because they're spending a lot of time in the dim dark of their burrows underground. They really rely a lot on their whiskers. And then the squirrel on the far right is one that I think a lot of people don't see very often, but are surprisingly common. This is flying squirrels. There's a number of species. We in Texas have one. We'll talk about him later, but flying squirrels are kind of the weirdest squirrels. They are clearly related to tree squirrels. When they do climb trees, they have long, fluffy tails for balance, but they have a unique adaptation. They have a flap of skin that stretches from their wrists to their ankles. It's called a patagium. We'll talk more about that later. But they can stretch that membrane, skin membrane out and actually glide. It's not true flight. They can't gain altitude, but they can do a very controlled descent. They can glide from tree to tree. And you will notice their furry tails are actually flat, shaped like a rudder, so they can use that tail to guide themselves as they're flying. You will also notice that their eyes are huge because these guys are nocturnal. So they need really, really keen eyesight to be able to see in the dark. So I've just given you the description of our 3 squirrel types. I don't know if you guys are nerds like me or the appropriate age, but when I hear tree, ground, and flying types, my brain instantly goes to Pokemon. So Pokemon has kind of been off and on for a long time, but if you have young people in your life that you were trying to get interested in nature, hit them with the Pokemon reference, see if they cling to it, because I know a lot of kids love Pokemon. So this is a great way to get kids thinking about adaptations, is to break these animals into types. So we have tree, in Pokemon it would be grass, ground, and flying types. So here's a quiz, pop quiz. I'll have to pretend that you take this because I can't really see your responses, but I've got 3 silhouettes here. One on the left, one in the middle, one on the right. Distinct body shapes. One has a long tail with a membrane of skin between the legs. One has a long furry tail, reasonably long ears. One is very sturdy and stocky with a short tail and short legs. Think about which type of squirrel would be which kind of Pokemon. Let you think about that for a second. Hopefully you got it right. You got your flying squirrel on the far left, your tree squirrel in the middle, and your ground squirrel on the right. This is a fun exercise. There's a lot of other types for Pokemon, but this works really, really well for squirrels. So if you have a reasonable diversity of squirrels in your area or lots of good pictures of squirrels, this is a fun challenge to give people. Is it a tree squirrel, a flying squirrel, or a ground type squirrel? I'm going to take a really quick break. Michelle, Mary Pearl, are there any questions that I can answer real quick?
Yeah, actually, there's some questions coming in about squirrel behavior, about some aggressive squirrels that folks have seen and why there's some that have aggressive tendencies and others that are not. There's another question on coloration changes in squirrels throughout the year. So this individual's in Houston and says it looks like they changed their appearance throughout the year coloration wise.
All right, I actually will be addressing both of those questions a little later. So hold that thought. I will get to those when I get to the individual squirrel species. But thank you for reminding me about the color thing, because I might not have brought it up.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. I'll make sure to talk about that. So let's talk about squirrels in general for a minute, and then we'll go down to the specifics. So squirrels are rodents, like mice and rats. People tend to forget that squirrels are omnivores, just like pretty much every other rodent. They use those sharp, strong, sturdy incisors, those front teeth, and they have some good chewing teeth in the back. We North Americans, Texans, often imagine squirrels as eating things like acorns, which they do. They love seeds and nuts. That is a big part of their diet, especially in the fall and the winter. But squirrels are opportunists. They eat just about everything. So the reason I didn't like squirrels up until relatively recently is because they are big predators of birds. You may not know that, but that is true. Squirrels will eat birds' eggs. They will actually eat adult birds if they can catch them. I apologize for the gore, but that picture in the top center, that is in fact a squirrel chowing down on a female house sparrow. Yes, squirrels will eat live prey. They like lizards, frogs, small mice, even things like that. They'll eat little critters that they can catch. They love insects. Squirrels will eat insects, especially flying squirrels. Squirrels eat a lot of plants. We've talked about the seeds, but they'll also eat sometimes leaves, shoots, definitely fruits and berries. Squirrels will eat your tomato plants. Ask me how I know. Although in that case, generally they're looking more for moisture. And then squirrels will eat some weird stuff too. Squirrels will often chew on things like power lines and wires. That's partly to help them wear down their teeth because their teeth are always growing. And if they didn't wear down their teeth would eventually start growing down through their skull, which is not a good thing. Squirrels will also chew on bones and shells. So you see that squirrel on the bottom right, he is chewing on a chicken wing. He's not going so much for the chicken, he's really going for the bone. He needs calcium. Calcium is a really important nutrient in mammals, among other critters, and it can be hard to get calcium. And one of the best ways to get calcium is to eat eggshells, bones, and like seashells and snail shells. So you will often see rodents like squirrels chewing on bones and things, which looks a bit weird, but they're just trying to get some nutrition. They can't go down to the corner GNC and grab some vitamins. Squirrels are sensory masters. They have a wide range of senses and really impressive sensory adaptations. One of the most obvious to humans, because we are visual creatures, is their eyes. Squirrels tend to have large eyes and excellent eyesight. Now, squirrels are red-green colorblind. The vast majority of mammals, other than humans, are red-green colorblind, but tree squirrels are a little less red-green colorblind than many other kinds of mammals. That color sensitivity really helps them in their environment try to identify things behind the green leaves, like a ripe fruit versus green leaves. Day active squirrels, so the ground squirrels and the tree squirrels, they have built-in sunglasses. So they actually have a yellowish color coating to their eyes, which filters out some of the harsh sunlight that they experience in their environments. So it helps, promote their vision, improve the contrast. Nocturnal squirrels, like flying squirrels, they do not have that yellow coating because they don't need it because they're active at night. All squirrels have great hearing and excellent sense of smell, but one of their most important senses is touch. Squirrels have an extensive number of whiskers. So the picture I have is showing the face of a squirrel, and you can see all the whiskers. The scientific word for whiskers is vibrissae. So it's got a ton of vibrissae in its face. But you'll also notice there's whiskers on the chin, on the throat. There's actually whiskers on the inside of the wrists and ankles, and sometimes some on the belly as well. And all these whiskers are to help squirrels move around in dark environments or when they can't see well. So squirrels' eyes are placed on the sides of their heads, which gives them almost 360-degree field of vision, but it means that they only have a very, very narrow range of overlapping fields of view in the front of their face. They don't have good binocular vision, is what I'm saying. So they can't see super close in front of them. So they start relying on their whiskers to feel what's right in front of their little faces. They can also use their whiskers on their ankles and feet to feel where they're climbing. And they can use the whiskers on their throats and bellies to feel the movement of air as they're leaping from spot to spot or moving in the constricted space of a burrow. All those are very useful pieces of information for animals that really need to get around. And now we come to, I think, the most underappreciated part of a squirrel, which is the tail. So squirrel tails are incredibly important to squirrel survival. Number one, they're just a big blood-filled structure. So any big blood-filled structure that comes off of an animal can be used for thermoregulation. That means regulating an animal's body temperature. So they can move blood, pump blood into the tail, and that helps release heat. So all that nice hot blood goes out into the tail, it loses heat to the environment, helps shed heat, helps keep the squirrel cool. Or they can do the opposite. They can stop pumping blood to the tail and keep that nice warm blood circulating in a smaller area in their body, and that heat helps keep the squirrel warm. Squirrels can also wrap their tails around themselves like a blanket if it's long enough, which is really adorable. Squirrels use their tails for balance. It helps them as they climb along tree branches, or in the case of flying squirrels, they can even use it as a rudder as they're gliding from tree to tree. Squirrels also use their tails for communication. Every species of squirrel, no matter how short their tail is, they use their tails to talk to one another. So they lift their tails to emphasize something. Maybe while they're vocalizing, they'll stick their tail up as a visual indicator that they're trying to say something. They may wag their tails back and forth to make a point. All kinds of body positions squirrels can have to talk to one another or to predators using their tails. And this is my favorite part about squirrel tails. Squirrels can use their tails for defense. So multiple species of squirrels that live on the ground have evolved to use tails to protect them against snakes. So on this page, you will see a Cape ground squirrel from Africa using its tail as a big, fluffy, bristly structure to make it seem bigger than it is. So that squirrel's pushing its tail all the way across its back, making it twice its size to intimidate that cobra that could be coming to try to eat the squirrel's babies. But some squirrels take it a step further. This isn't a Texas example, but I think it's pretty sweet. So let's break it down. So I've got two little videos. I hope they're working. Don't panic. I'm going to try to walk you through them. So in the top left, there's a California ground squirrel. These California ground squirrels live in California. They're not that big. Their young are very vulnerable to rattlesnakes. So rattlesnakes can climb into the burrows and eat the babies. So the adult ground squirrels have developed a really fascinating adaptation using their tails. So you will notice that this female ground squirrel in the top left is chewing on a rattlesnake skin, a shed rattlesnake skin that she found in the environment. She's going to spread that chewed up rattlesnake skin paste on her tail. She'll also spread it on her babies, which is really weird. It took a while for scientists to figure out what the heck these squirrels were doing. Were they eating these tails? Were they doing something weird? It turns out that when a ground squirrel is threatened by a rattlesnake, like the squirrel in the bottom right, what she'll do is she'll stick her tail up, start waving it in the air, and she actually starts pumping more blood into her tail to make it hotter. So what's happening is she's creating snake aromatherapy. So she's got this snake paste smeared on her tail. She's heating up her tail and waving it around. She's wafting that concentrated rattlesnake smell in the air, and she's confusing the heck out of that snake. So rattlesnakes mostly sense the world through smell and through heat, because rattlesnakes are pit vipers and they can see in infrared, or they can sense heat. So what this snake is experiencing is a hot, snake-smelling, frantically moving signal that it has no idea what to do with. So they tend to back off when the squirrels use this type of defense. So this is pretty cool and a really neat adaptation to talk about, just with something simple like a squirrel's tail. There's all this cool stuff going on that thankfully amazing scientists are sitting and figuring out.
Kelsey, there's some great questions coming in about squirrel tails.
Yes.
And I apologize for interrupting.
No worries.
We have some questions about what happens when a squirrel loses part of their tail. And can you explain kind of what may happen with that?
Absolutely. So I'm not a vet, so I can't speak to the long-term ramifications, but you can look at it a couple of ways. When a squirrel loses part of its tail, it is reducing function. It's losing functionality for that tail. So let's say it's a tree squirrel, like a gray squirrel. It won't be able to use its tail as well for thermoregulation. So it won't be able to lose heat or gain heat as well. It won't be able to use its tail as well for balance. It won't be able to use its tail as well for communication. And it won't be able to use its tail as well for defense. For a squirrel, like a flying squirrel, losing part of their tail was a pretty big deal. They might not be able to fly as well. They won't be able to control their glides. It's not quite as big a deal for some of the ground squirrels. It does impact their communication. Obviously, it would be a big impact for these California ground squirrels because they use their tails in defense. However, while their quality of life is impacted, they are alive. So another function of squirrel tails is to be a target. So if you're a squirrel running around with a nice long fluffy tail and you get attacked by something and it bites your tail off, at least you're still alive. So you may have lost some of your livelihood, but you do get the chance to live another day. So it's not good for the squirrel to lose their tail, but it's better than dying. I hope that makes sense.
That's great.
Are we good on tails?
Yes, thank you so much.
Oh, you're
fantastic.
welcome. All right, so let's move on to squirrels in Texas. So if you did come to enjoy virtually my talk last year already, this will at least be partly new. So I hope this is good. So because I've broadened my squirrel list. Originally, I had focused on squirrels in Houston, but then I realized there's people who don't live in Houston. Gasp. I know. So I threw in another squirrel to try to make this a little more broadly applicable. So hopefully at least one of these guys lives where you live. There's a number of squirrel species that live in Texas, but I'm going to talk about these three because they really illustrate the three squirrel types, the tree, ground, and flying. And they have some really excellent points that you can bring up if you're ever encountering these guys in the wild. So fox squirrels, let's talk about fox squirrels. Fox squirrels are the most common squirrel where I live in Houston. They are all over Eastern North America. There are actually fox squirrels in the West as well. It's a different species, but very, very similar. Fox squirrels are highly variable in coloration. So I actually talked about this in my last version of the talk. I wasn't going to talk about it in this one, but since someone brought it up, the squirrel I have in this picture is the classic fox squirrel for me in Houston. This is the color morph that I tend to see where I live, but that is not the color morph that you see in other places. So some fox squirrels are totally black. Some fox squirrels have like a black front. Some are very, very red. Some have white patches. Those populations are defined by geography. So you'll get, say, two different populations of fox squirrels on two different sides of a canyon, like Grand Canyon, and they'll have slightly different colors. That's a genetic thing. You'll also get a lot of color variation over the year and through weird genetic quirks. So fox squirrels and gray squirrels, which are very similar, can both be albinos, so they can be totally white with no pigmentation, sort of pinky blue eyes. They can be leucistic, so they can be mostly white or just with white patches, but they still have some pigmentation on their bodies. Or they can be melanistic, so that means they're totally black, or partially melanistic. And there's a couple of others they can be, but you'll end up with like all black individuals or partially white individuals. I know here at the Arboretum in Houston, we have a melanistic, so a totally black fox squirrel, which is really cool. Squirrels will also change their color through the year based on the thickness of their fur. It's much easier to see for me in gray squirrels, but squirrel fur is ticked. That means that there's like different rings of pigment on a single hair. So when you look at the fox squirrel here, you'll see he looks kind of salt and pepper. That's because each of his hairs has like a pale tip and then a dark midsection and then like another little pale line and then another dark section. When he grows thicker fur for the winter, some of that gets obscured. And then some of his very soft, sort of single colored underfur sticks out more, especially behind his ears. This is really noticeable in gray squirrels. In gray squirrels, they actually develop these really bright white, fluffy patches behind their ears that may be important for communication. I haven't really been able to figure out exactly what they're doing with those patches. Squirrels aren't particularly well studied. So yes, that's a long-winded way of saying squirrel coloration absolutely does vary through the year. So fox squirrels are running around, being colorful. They are classic tree squirrels. They have long tails for balance. They are exceptional athletes. Fox squirrels in particular can jump at least 20 feet from a standing stop. They can fall, I think it was 20 or 30 feet as well, without major damage. They are amazing at doing the kinds of things you see gymnasts doing in the Olympics. When you see a gymnast do a big vault, like a big jump, and then twist and spin in midair, you'll notice that they tuck their limbs in, which squirrels do too, or they'll throw their legs out to slow their fall. They'll make minor adjustments to their body position in space using their tails and arms, and they'll always keep their eyes on a target. So they'll rotate their body to make sure their head is always looking in one direction so they don't get disoriented. Really fascinating. Lots of good slow motion videos of squirrels on YouTube. Fox squirrels like trees, they are tree squirrels, but they actually don't need that many trees. These guys prefer open woodland or savanna. They can get away with just having a few trees here and there. So they're really good at living in suburban and urban environments. That's probably why these are so common in Houston now. And they're actually pretty widespread across Texas because usually where you are, there's enough trees to support fox squirrels. Not everywhere, but in many places. So fox squirrels are very tolerant. They eat everything, but their favorite foods are nuts. They love pecan and hickory nuts. They'll eat acorns as well. And then they'll eat fungus, mushrooms. They'll eat insects. They'll eat live prey, birds, eggs, things like that. So they're pretty wide-ranging, adaptable squirrels, which is one of the reasons why they're so successful. They're just all over the place. They've also been widely introduced to other places, which is not so fun for those countries, but good for the squirrels. So these guys are so common. They're really great examples to look at for squirrel behavior. The problem with these guys is they're so common, they're overlooked. Just like me, I would ignore squirrels because they're boring. They're just backyard animals. So when you actually start writing up curriculum for a class on squirrels and you start looking into scientific studies of their behavior in biology, you come up empty. There's not that much studied about these squirrels, so they're still pretty mysterious. Most of the best information about things like fox squirrels comes from wildlife rehab. So fox squirrels are have an interesting social structure. They're mostly solitary, but they're very relaxed about it. They have very overlapping territories. They don't care too much about defending their territories. They care a little bit, mostly during the breeding season, but they don't care as much as you would imagine. They seem to have loose social hierarchies within sexes and maybe between sexes. So like say all the females in a given area kind of have a pecking order and all the males in a given area kind of have a pecking order, but it's a little more loosey-goosey when it comes to mixed sex interactions, but that's all fairly mysterious. They do use a variety of ways of communicating with each other in a social context. They make vocalizations, sort of barks and growls and chirps and squeaks. They'll use their tails. They'll use body posture, and they'll do this fun, chasey, jumpy thing. So the little video I have on here is of two fox squirrels chasing each other, bouncing around and chasing. So that could be positive, negative, or both, that chasing. It's often done between siblings, like young squirrel siblings, as play. So you'll see squirrels playing with each other by jumping and somersaulting and playing tag, that kind of thing. You will also see this chasing behavior during mating. So this is the part that's a little more appropriate for adults and less appropriate for kids. So if you have young people, perhaps cover their ears for a moment, because squirrels are promiscuous breeders. That means that squirrels will breed with just about anybody in just about any combination. They aren't super picky. Females only go into season for a very short time, usually one day in early summer and like one day in late winter, early spring. And she will attract a bevy of males who will all start chasing her and then jumping over and fighting one another in order to access her. And so she'll lead this big old pile of males on a merry chase up and down through the trees. Usually by the end of the chase, most of the males are either too tired or too beat up to keep following her, and one dominant male will win the rights to mate. This doesn't always work out. Sometimes the dominant male gets so busy fighting the other males that he gets distracted, and then what are called sneaker males, who weren't participating in the chase, they just come in and get things done. And then sometimes the female mates with multiple males. Anything goes. But the end result is the female will end up with babies. She will give birth to her babies in a nest. Fox squirrels will either construct a nest out of leaves and twigs. Those are called drays, D-R-E-Y. They look kind of like big leafy soccer balls up in trees. Or they will put soft nesting material in a tree cavity. And squirrels will often construct multiple drays. They'll have one in a hole, they'll have multiple in a tree, but the female will pick one dray to have her babies in. And the babies are born blind and naked and helpless. They stay with their mom for up to 3 months before they're independent. After that, scientists don't really know exactly how family dynamics work. It seems that sisters may retain relationships with one another, but it's not super clear. So if you're ever interested in doing an animal behavior project, study fox squirrels, because there isn't really that much known about them. Nope, I'm gonna skip that. So conservation, I know someone at the very beginning of the class asked about what squirrels do for ecology, what squirrels do for ecosystems. And this is one of the major things. So tree squirrels, like fox squirrels, they eat a lot of seeds. So when they're eating through there, they'll eat just about anything through the warm months, through spring and summer. But for the fall and winter, they store nuts and seeds. We all know this about squirrels. This is a classic stereotype for squirrels, but it is ecologically invaluable. And there's a lot of work coming up now in the literature about the mechanics of how this works. So squirrels will take seeds and acorns and things, and then they will bury them in the ground to store them for later use in the winter. They will remember most of those caches. Squirrels have exceptional spatial memory, but they will forget at least some of them. They just can't possibly remember every single one. And so those seeds that get forgotten will germinate and grow into new trees. And so it turns out that squirrels are major drivers of forest ecosystems. They spread forests, they maintain forests, they can restore forests that have been cut down, and they have been driving tree evolution. So the morphology of tree seeds can vary depending on how they interact with squirrels. So things like acorns and other large tree seeds may develop either thicker coats to protect against squirrel predation, or they may invest extra energy in creating a really tasty, fatty package to try to tempt animals like squirrels into grabbing them and spreading them, and then hoping that at least some of those seeds survive. It's a really cool system, just kind of starting to be pieced apart. There's a good paper that I've kind of highlighted here. If you're interested in the information, I can send you the link to the actual paper. Now we're going to move on to another type of squirrel in Texas. That's the southern flying squirrel. So these guys need trees. They're a little more tree dependent than the fox squirrel, but they're not super picky. They don't need a hugely dense forest. They are pretty tolerant of, say, urban conditions. So they're quite common in cities like Houston. They are small, very mouse-like, and they are nocturnal. So they come out at night. They're not as well known by people simply because we don't interact with them. They're out after dark. As you can see, they're gray on top, white underneath. The dark line you see along the side of the squirrel is that patagium, the gliding membrane, and it stretches from the wrist to the ankle. And you can see the little guy spread out. He uses that patagium to glide from tree to tree. They have flat tails, these for rudders, huge eyes, and they are excellent little omnivores. All squirrels are omnivores. They'll eat animal and plant material, but flying squirrels are especially omnivorous. They actually lean to the carnivore side because during the spring and summer, they're eating mostly insects like moths, birds' eggs, adult birds, lizards, things like that. Which is why I didn't like them, because they were eating, quote unquote, my birds that I was studying. But they also do eat seeds and plant material, and they will store caches of seeds just like your classic tree squirrels. These guys are fascinating. Again, they're very poorly studied, which is a shame, but from what little we know, and I'm using the royal we as in the scientific community, they are highly social, very, very social. They probably have complex social structures. That's not terrifically well studied. They're always up in each other's business, especially in the winter. They'll all pile into the same roost. So you end up with like 15 flying squirrels all stuffed in one tree hole. They have really complex vocalizations. They squeak, and they actually possibly talk ultrasonically. So they produce high-pitched sounds that humans can't hear, but it's very likely that they can hear it. So they may be kind of like bats in that they're talking in a range that humans can't hear. They may actually be using a mild form of echolocation, but that's not verified yet. They, like the fox squirrels, they breed promiscuously, probably in a similar way. They breed in late winter, early summer. They have their babies in a nest. In particular, in the south, sort of southeastern parts of Texas, they love Spanish moss. Spanish moss is an excellent nesting material for these guys. So they'll go out of their way to find Spanish moss or lichen or some other similar material to line their nest. And just like the fox squirrels, they'll build a nest in a tree hole, or they'll actually build a little tiny dray, a little leafy nest or a Spanish mossy nest out on the branches of a tree. Super, super cute. However, I will caution you, if you know there are flying squirrels in your area, don't go poking around the nests because, bless their cute little hearts, they're one of the few remaining vectors for typhoid fever. So every year, humans, a handful of humans will be infected in the US with what's called sylvatic typhus, which is typhoid fever derived from flying squirrels. And that's mostly from their dried poop, which is in their little squirrel nests. So don't go poking around flying squirrel nests unless you absolutely have to. It's highly treatable. It's not going to kill you, but prefer to avoid that if possible.
Hey, Kelsey, there were a number of questions about litter size.
Litter size, oh boy.
And gestation period for not only fox squirrels, but flying squirrels as well.
So I believe the gestation period for fox squirrels is like 40 some odd days, and that's literally because I just looked it up before the class. But I would have to double check. I would not know offhand the gestation period for the flying squirrels. I know they spend about 3 months approximately with their mom before they are independent. Litter size depends on the species of squirrel. So for fox squirrels, it's like 2 to 4-ish. I would suspect it's similar for the flying squirrels, maybe more. But not as big perhaps as you might think, considering their mortality rate. I will say for most mammals, mortality rate is always high. Well, for almost all living things, mortality rate is highest in the first year. So squirrels are most vulnerable when they're babies. They're small and helpless and stuck in a nest and they can't get away. So that's the time when most squirrels die. So the life expectancy, the average life expectancy for a squirrel of almost any species is a year or less in the wild. But that's because they're looking at squirrels as a whole, which includes all those ones that die before their first year. If you cut out first year mortality, squirrels can live a long time. I believe the record for fox squirrels is 18 years in captivity, which is impressive. And I know there are wild squirrels that have been recorded living like 8 to 10 years. So if they can make it past that first year, they can live for quite a long time. I hope that answers some questions.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, cool. So these guys are really cool, these flying squirrels. And I have to bring in my bird stories, right? So the reason I used to dislike squirrels was because of flying squirrel predation on bird nests, especially cavity nesting birds. And if you live in Houston, like me, one particular cavity nesting bird is of particular importance. That is the red cockaded woodpecker. That's our endangered bird that lives just north of Houston, but let's be generous. And they are a tiny at-risk population. And unfortunately, they are natural prey items for flying squirrels. Flying squirrels are very good at predating bird nests, and they will predate red cockaded woodpecker nests, but we don't want that because there's just so few red cockaded woodpeckers left. Any loss is a major blow to the species. So some brilliant scientists have been trying to figure out how to do this safely for everybody. You don't want to just go around killing flying squirrels. That wouldn't be particularly helpful in the long run. You can't put a cage around it because then the birds can't get in. So one big difference between mammals and birds is that birds cannot taste capsaicin. Capsaicin is the spicy stuff in hot peppers, chili peppers. Squirrels can develop a taste for it, but they're often initially repelled by that spicy flavor. So there's been some trials, not in Texas, but of smearing some basically pure capsaicin compounds around the edges of these red cockaded woodpecker nests to deter flying squirrel predation. And it seems to be working. So I thought that was kind of a fun little conservation connection, where even though the impact of the flying squirrels is negative in this context, because the population of the birds is so small, there are relatively peaceful ways to get around that. Again, if you're interested in the paper, I can get you a link. And finally, we come to the sort of least classic squirrel-like squirrel, but one of the more famous squirrel species. This is the black-tailed prairie dog. These guys used to be extremely common all across central North America, but their population has reduced dramatically. And so now, whereas they used to be almost all over Texas, anywhere where there were grasslands, which included Houston, now they are in only smaller parts of the state. Their populations are much, much lower than they used to be, which has some implications, which I'm going to talk about. But prairie dogs are classic ground squirrels. Stocky, short limbs, very strong front claws, short tail, folded over ears. All of those are adaptations for digging, being low to the ground, being in constricted spaces underground, and then storing a lot of fat for winter life because they live in grassland environments. They don't have access to the big energy dense seeds like acorns and hickory nuts and pecans that the tree squirrel and the flying squirrels have. They have to make do with the more numerous but less nutritious things like grass seeds, grass shoots, the leaves and buds of shrubs, things like that. So they do store food for the winter, but they need to store a lot of fat in their bodies to make it through those cold periods when there isn't as much vegetation around. So they're chunky, they're chubby little guys, and that's to keep them alive. You will see that video on the bottom right. There is an amazing camera in a prairie dog burrow, and you will see it's pretty tight quarters in a lot of those spaces. But they can construct these incredible underground cities. So let's talk a little bit about prairie dog social life. So we talked about the tree squirrels, the box squirrels being semi-social, the flying squirrels being quite social. Prairie dogs take it to another level. Prairie dogs are hyper social. So They live in little family groups called coteries. So there'll be a dominant male, maybe a couple other males, but a dominant male and his females, the females that breed with him, and then their offspring. That's a coterie. It's just one little sort of extended family group. Those coteries will group together in little bunches called wards. So you'll end up with like a handful of coteries in a ward. But then wards will gather together into what are called towns. And so those towns can grow to the thousands of individuals. So you have these massive, massive colonies of a whole bunch of different families all nestled together. They clear out a wide area of vegetation around their towns. They'll dig burrows into the ground, and they'll dig multiple types of burrows. They'll dig just straight basic bolt holes, so just like a hole in the ground to get away from predators. They'll dig sentry areas, so they'll pile dirt in like a volcano shape, like a funnel around a hole, so they can stand up on the top of that little hill and look over the landscape. Just gets them a little elevation, so they can look for predators on top of that little hill. And then they'll create a chamber just under the ground, like a pretty wide chamber with a big round space. And that's actually a way for them to listen to sounds. It amplifies the sounds from outside. It's called a sentry chamber. And they'll wait in that sentry chamber and listen. And if they don't hear any sounds amplified in the sentry chamber, they know it's safe to go outside, which is really cool. They'll dig burrows like 15 feet or more down to the ground, and they put their nesting chambers at the bottom of those deepest, deepest burrows. Those are the safest places for them to be. They're constantly interacting with each other. They're grooming. It looks like they're kissing, but they'll groom each other's faces. They'll touch each other. They'll chirp and bark and flip their tails. They use different body postures. There's been one guy who studies the vocalizations of black-tailed prairie dogs. He is convinced that they have basically a language, so that each call will be slightly different to mean different things. Like they'll have an alarm call, but that alarm call may be shaded slightly differently to indicate a hawk, a human, a coyote, a dog. He even thinks that they can indicate individual characteristics. So like a person wearing a red shirt versus a person wearing a blue shirt. That's not been replicated by other groups. It's certainly possible that their language is very sophisticated. I would consider it probably pretty likely that their language is very sophisticated, but it may not be quite that sophisticated. Jury's still out on that one. Keep watching this space. But they do these amazing displays, things like the bark yip. So I hope this works. See some bark yips, jump yips. So you'll notice that they combine the call, that squeaky little yip, with a visual signal, with a jump, their paws forward, their tail down, their head back. That's to make the signal really obvious. What does the jump yip mean? I'm not entirely sure. It seems to vary from population of prairie dog to population of prairie dog. In any case, it does seem to hold an important function for the groups, because you'll notice when one prairie dog does it, all the other ones start doing it too. So they're really fascinating. They're pretty well studied, but there's still a lot that we don't know about them. Really fascinating, very sophisticated little creatures. And they are very, very important when it comes to local conservation issues. Black-tailed prairie dogs are ecosystem engineers. If you've not heard that term, they are animals that create something in the ecosystem that improves the survival of many, many, many other species. So examples are things like woodpeckers. They use their holes to create homes for other animals. Well, they don't do it on purpose, but other animals use those woodpecker holes. And then beaver dams. Beavers create dams, which create whole new ecosystems to provide space for other animals. Prairie dogs are just like that. Prairie dogs, with their extensive burrows and their habitat clearing, create unique spaces in the environment that are critical for the survival of our complex prairie ecosystems, and that's going away. Prairie dogs populations have plummeted because of loss of habitat. They've lost grasslands, and through persecution. They are not popular with farmers for good reasons and for misunderstood reasons. They have a worse reputation than they deserve. So their populations have dramatically decreased, and a lot of animals that once relied on prairie dogs are now crashing. So most famously, the black-footed ferret. So the black-footed ferret is a highly endangered animal that preys almost exclusively on prairie dogs, and they need those prairie dog areas to live. So without prairie dogs, you don't get the ferrets. Burrowing owls use prairie dog burrows and prairie dogs themselves as excellent neighbors and predator detectors. Mountain plovers, things like that, other birds enjoy nesting in areas of prairie dogs. And then prairie dogs also affect the vegetation and insect communities around them. There's some good papers starting to come out very recently. There's one that was published this year on how prairie dogs reduce invasive species in their areas. They preferentially chew woody shrubs, allowing the grasses to come up, which has a ripple effect through the ecosystem, which affects everything up to insect and even bird populations. So it's a fascinating, complex system, really excellent animal to talk about when you're talking about conservation, and a great local example. So squirrels are a gateway drug. I hope you understand now, after all of this, that squirrels are in your backyards. They're everywhere, and they are a really great way to open the conversation to talk about anatomy, about adaptations, about behavior, ecology, and conservation, to tie in the other animals and the plants. So I hope you have a new appreciation for squirrels. I hope you've learned a little something. And please let me know if you have any questions. Ask away in the Q&A, or if you want to contact me, I'm sure my email is somewhere on your materials. If not, it's right up here on the screen. So yeah.
Kelsey, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. We are right at that hour, so if you're willing to stay just a little bit longer, we've got a ton of questions that have come into Q&A.
Awesome.
For those folks who have to leave with the hour mark, if they're watching over their lunch hour, don't worry, we'll have this recording posted to our website, and you can catch up on the last couple of minutes here at a later time. So with this, I'm going to try and lump some of these questions together. There's over 80 questions that have come in, so there's a lot. I don't think we're going to be able to answer all of your questions, so I apologize if we don't get to yours. There was a really interesting question earlier about invasive species of squirrels, co-breeding of squirrels. So I'm trying to kind of lump some questions together. If the current native species overlap in breeding, and then kind of what the overlap is in territories of our native species as well.
Okay, so here in Texas, we don't really have any invasive squirrels. We may, okay, I'm gonna make this short. Squirrels may be bumping up against one another that didn't as much previously because we've changed the habitat. We've either reduced trees or added trees, depending on where we live. Like in grasslands, we've often added trees, and in forested areas, we've often taken away trees. So for example, fox squirrels, well, it's a complicated story. So fox squirrels and gray squirrels in Houston, which are the two that I'm more familiar with, they're very closely related. They do interbreed somewhat. It isn't super common, so it doesn't seem to be a big issue for the survival of the two species. They seem to be doing quite well, even with the occasional hybrid. I don't know of much other hybridization in squirrels in Texas, but you'll have to forgive me because I just don't know all the different species. What I do know is that gray fox squirrels, but especially gray squirrels, have been widely introduced to other places. I'm actually from Western Canada, and in Western Canada, we had one native species of squirrel on this island where I'm from, which was a red squirrel, which is much smaller and a different color. But now gray squirrels have been introduced, and they are causing pretty significant problems. I know they are in Europe, they're in Asia. I believe they're in Australia as well. And gray squirrels are usually causing problems. wherever they've been introduced. They are extremely adaptive. They're omnivorous. They're great at living with humans. And that's a recipe for dominance in an ecosystem. Actually, one of the best places to look for information on American squirrels is British science, because the Brits are sick of our squirrels eating their native squirrels out of house and home. And so they've done way more detailed work on their behavior in the field than a lot of American scientists, because we take our squirrels for granted, which is kind of cool and also kind of sad. So a lot of the detailed information I've got on squirrel behavior is from British sources. So if you're interested in learning about squirrel behavior and invasive species squirrel action, I highly encourage you to Google like British squirrels, and you will find a wealth of interesting information.
Excellent, thank you. I'm trying to keep up with the questions as well. So some other questions are asking about predators of fox squirrels or gray squirrels. And then what, there's some questions about human predators as well, or how humans interact with squirrels in a predatory way.
Yes, so all squirrels are highly predated. They are delicious little morsels of food. So everybody eats them. Birds of prey, hawks, red-tailed hawks in Texas are a great predator of your gray squirrels and your fox squirrels. Owls are big predators of flying squirrels. Foxes, like gray fox and red fox, will eat squirrels. Coyotes will eat squirrels. Snakes, rat snakes eat baby squirrels. Other squirrels will eat baby squirrels sometimes. Ooh, actually, this is not necessarily a fun thing, but it's kind of interesting. The biggest baby predator for prairie dogs is other prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are famous for infanticide. That is when members of your species kill your babies. One third of baby prairie dogs are killed by other prairie dogs, which is kind of ridiculous. It seems to have something to do with neighboring females trying to reduce the competition. So the female next door will come in and kill the babies of her neighbor, partly to reduce the pressure on the food in the area, but also because they're so social. Females that don't have pups will help care for each other's pups. They'll turn into babysitters. So basically, they're murdering their neighbors' kids so that they can act as babysitters and help reduce the load on their caring. It's a little dark, but it's very interesting. Oh, humans. Humans are good and bad for squirrels. So humans have changed the habitat. So in areas where they planted more trees, that's allowed the spread of things like fox squirrels and gray squirrels and flying squirrels. They also can be bad for the habitat for things like grassland squirrels, ground squirrels, like prairie dogs. Obviously, human hunting has a huge pressure on prairie dogs because humans kill them as a nuisance species. Human hunting is present for tree squirrels like fox squirrels and gray squirrels, but it's not as big as it used to be back in the bad old days. It's kind of a negligible impact, as far as I know, on their populations. The higher impact is through traffic and pets, human pets. So cats and dogs will kill squirrels, and then cars kill squirrels. That's our biggest impact on their populations.
And then I think kind of tying in with that too, Kelsey, is the idea of you know, if my daughter's found a baby squirrel on the ground, what's the best procedure? What do you do with that? Where that predation could come in as well.
So always go to your local wildlife rehab for the best information. But from what I have absorbed from our wonderful wildlife rehab organizations in Houston, is if you see a baby squirrel and it's naked and pink and blind and helpless, try to find the nest where it came from and put it back. That is by far the best thing you can do. Keep pets away from it, please. Your cats should be indoors anyways, but yes, keep cats and dogs away from fallen little baby squirrels. If they are visibly injured, if they're bleeding, if there's a bone sticking out, if you cannot find the nest, you've done everything you can, you cannot find that squirrel nest, then you take it, wrap it up in something warm. Don't try to feed it. Don't try to give it water. You're just going to hurt it. Just leave it, keep it warm, take it to your nearest wildlife rehab. If it has fur and open eyes, it's probably supposed to be there. It's probably just exploring the environment and just happened to get away from mom for a minute. Mom is almost certainly somewhere in a tree looking for it. So just leave it alone. Keep your pets away from it, keep your kids away from it. Just make sure it's not running into traffic if you can, but leave it alone. Do not kidnap furred baby squirrels because they're just fine.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that goes with most other juvenile or young wildlife species that you may stumble upon. Is probably the best scenario is to watch it at a distance for a while, and then it only interfere if you need to interfere at that point. I've got a few more questions, Kelsey, if you've got just a little bit more time with us.
Absolutely.
Okay. One question from early on in your presentation, you talked about the adaptability of their feet and their flexibility of their feet. Can you go into more detail about how the flexibility of the feet of the tree squirrels allow them to go down a tree face?
Let's see if I can go back to that. Long way. Oh, there we go. Okay, so imagine you are climbing a tree, which is pretty straightforward as a human, depending on the shape of the tree. We're pretty dexterous creatures. Climbing up is pretty easy. Climbing down is the hard part. So as a human, I would imagine if you've ever climbed a tree, you climb down foot first. Your back feet go down, and you have to look behind you. You're very slow. You're very awkward. Your feet have a hard time gripping the surface. It's not an easy thing. You have to pull with your hands to support the whole weight of your body and slowly lower yourself down. That's how it is for many animals. Like a gray fox. Gray foxes are excellent tree climbers. They have long, sharp claws that are always out, ready to grip the surface. They are predators of squirrels, but they are dogs still. Foxes are dogs. They have dog-like paws. They're not super flexible. So when they climb down a tree, they're climbing down a tree, you know, fairly haphazardly. Squirrels, because their wrists and ankles are so flexible, you'll see when this tree squirrel is climbing down the tree, instead of his feet facing forward, so the only grip he would have would be on his front feet, his back feet can turn completely around. So his ankles, the bones in your wrists have lots of little nooks and crannies and bowls and valleys that all kind of press together on one another and limit your range of motion. So like when you move when you rotate your foot, when you wiggle your ankles around, your ankles can only bend so far because the bones in your ankles will start grinding against one another and they won't let your ankle bend backwards. And the ligaments in your ankle will only stretch so far. Squirrels, their ankle bones are much more like a ball and socket joint, like in your shoulder and your hips. So much more flexible. The ligaments are very flexible, so they're able to rotate that back foot completely around. So it's basically a second set of hands. They can grip with their little toes. So they can actually hang by their toes, their back toes, and leave their front paws open for like carrying nuts or something. It just helps take the pressure off their front feet and gives them much more flexibility for how they move down compared to stuff like us.
Excellent. That makes so much sense. Okay, last question, because I feel like we have pushed the limits with the questions. There's so many still coming in. There is a couple of questions on the differences between gray squirrels and fox squirrels, and then there's a few questions, and I've lost them now in the sea of questions about rock squirrels that are more hill country oriented.
Okay, so the gray squirrel and the fox squirrel I can really help you with because I'm most familiar with those guys. So on this page, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this guy eating the bird and this guy eating the chicken wing are Eastern Gray Squirrels. So they are very, very similar to fox squirrels in appearance. Easy to mistake one another, but the classic way to tell is the belly. So if you have a normal colored individual like this, the belly on a gray squirrel will always be white. And they have grayish fur and a grayish tail and right behind the ears. But really, the white belly is the big giveaway because, at least in Houston, fox squirrel has the gray back, but he has a foxy belly. He has an orangey foxy belly and orangey foxy colors in the tail. It's one of the reasons why they're called fox squirrels. So they've got that orange belly. If you have a fully black or fully white individual, which does happen periodically, it's extraordinarily difficult to tell them apart. But the belly is how I do it when I'm at the Arboretum. It's orange belly, it's a fox squirrel. If it's a white belly, it's a gray squirrel. As for rock squirrels, I'm not at all familiar with them. They are ground squirrels. They are going to be like prairie dogs, roughly, in ecology and behavior, but they're not nearly so social. They are going to be sturdy and short-legged, short-eared, relatively short-tailed. They've got a longer tail than a prairie dog. They're going to be a lot more like the California ground squirrels in their behavior, the ones that I showed you earlier fighting the snakes. The rock squirrels use their tails a lot in communication with one another. Though as far as I know, they're not nearly as colonial as, say, a prairie dog. But alas, I am not as familiar with their behavior just because I don't get them near me.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Kelsey, so much for your time today and all of your questions and information. We've gone quite a bit over our 1 o'clock hour promise, so you've got a lot to manage with hurricane cleanup potentially, and I hope that that you and your facilities are doing well with that. But again, thank you for your time today and for being an annual meeting speaker once again this year. We're excited to have you back with us in 34 days.
Awesome.
All right, and thanks everybody for joining us for our TMN Tuesday September event. As said earlier, this recording will be posted on our website later this afternoon, if not tomorrow morning. And we'll see you guys again next month.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Kelsey. So Kelsey, you should be good. I'm going to stick around a little longer and grab the questions. And then there was a request for your presentation links, or for the link.
Oh, for the papers?
The papers, yes. I'd love to put those on our website if you're willing to share those.
Absolutely. I will send you the info through an email. If you want to, I don't know what you do with the questions after the talks, but if there's any that I didn't answer,